Okay, chapter 23, guys. One more to go. Independence and Development in the Global South, 1914 to the present. Main idea: the independence of African and Asian countries from colonial rule had significant political, cultural, and economic effects in the Global South and throughout the rest of the world. Relevance. Relevance. The independence movements you'll be learning about in this chapter had a big influence on our own country. One of the people you'll learn about is Gandhi, who led the independence movement in India. His actions were a huge influence on Martin Luther King in our own country. These independence movements also had a huge impact on the global economy, which you'll learn more about in chapter 24. Setting the stage. Remember that the imperialism of the 19th century, in which Western countries, mostly Europe, controlled most of Africa. If you remember this map, the colors showing which European country controlled which part of Africa. And also much of Asia. We had here British India, French Indochina, the Dutch in what is now Indonesia, called the East Indies at the time, the United States and the Philippines, and even Japanese imperialism. In a relatively brief time, all of these countries gained independence from these powers. This chapter is about the causes and effects of those independence movements. The first red heading is called Toward Freedom: Struggles for Independence. From the 1940s to the 1970s, more than 50 nations gained their independence from European colonial control. The end of empire in world history. These independence movements were stimulated by a concept called national self-determination, a form of nationalism that emphasized the cultural unity and difference of these countries from their European rulers. The fall of these empires in the 20th century were an outcome of the rise of nationalism in the 19th century. And here's a map that shows the year of independence. And you can see the colors here are the original countries, European countries that controlled them. And basically, you can see if you look carefully at the dates that in a range of about 20 or 30 years, all of these countries gained their independence. It was an astonishing period of time in world history and a huge political shift and change in where the power is. Explaining African and Asian independence. So why did this happen? Your book goes through quite a few reasons why the independence movements happened when they did and the way that they did. Some of these are the weakening of Europe because of the two world wars, Cold War politics, in which the United States or the Soviet Union supported independence movements, the increasing education of African and Asian elites in the West, and that allowing them to move these independence movement forward back in their own country, citizens of these countries who were disaffected and upset with rule of Europeans, the rise of global trade, increasing the integration of these economies into the global economy and bringing some wealth to the countries, some success for people organizing anti-colonial movements, and also the global image of these European countries and the fact that public opinion started to turn against them. Each country had its own story of independence, and the book will focus on two main examples, India and South Africa. And that's the red heading called Comparing Freedom Struggles. India and South Africa both achieved independence from oppressive governments, but in significantly different ways. Starting with the case of India, ending British rule. There were some unique features of British rule that served to unite India in a number of ways. And these are going to lead to something called the Indian National Congress, which is a political party to represent Indian interests. At first, your book will explain that this party was really focused on helping the Western educated elites have a little bit more influence in the decision making. After World War I, the British were even more unpopular in India, and the Indian National Congress seemed even more necessary. And it was into this situation that Gandhi came to India with his message of nonviolent protest and independence. He called for the unity of all Indians and opposed industrialization. In this picture here, he's sitting by a spinning wheel, and he's wearing very primitive, traditional Indian clothing because he did not believe in participating in the industrial economy that was really the motivation for imperialism. So he was very popular in India, but he did face opposition, especially from Muslims and Hindus, who saw their religious differences as being too great to coexist in a unified India. When India did gain its independence, India split into two states, a Muslim and Hindu state, and there was quite a bit of violence during that partition. On this map here, you have India, which is predominantly Hindu, and you have the creation of a country out of British India called West Pakistan, which is predominantly Muslim. You have the creation of another country called East Pakistan, which is predominantly Muslim. This is now known as Bangladesh, by the way. And up here you have a region that is still disputed to this day between India and Pakistan called Kashmir. So the case of India shows us the challenges of throwing off foreign rule and starting down the path of self-determination. The second example is the case of South Africa and ending apartheid. South Africa was different in many ways from India. It actually became independent in 1910 from the British, but there was an oppressive white rule that continued into the 1990s, and it wasn't until 1994 that South Africa gained its independence from that oppressive rule. Similar to India, an African National Congress was formed to work for independence, and they had moderate attempts at reform that were not successful. And there was a party led by the ethnic group, the white ethnic group that we call Afrikaners, that was elected on an apartheid platform, and the leader of the resistance movement, Nelson Mandela, was imprisoned. There were quite a few protests in the decades that followed, and your book will describe these, and many of them were violent. And eventually, your book will explain to you that internal and external pressure on apartheid rulers led to the freeing of Mandela from prison, and eventually his election as the first president of a free South Africa. The amazing thing about this is that despite the oppressive nature of the rule for so many decades, this happened without a bloody civil war. Although South Africa has been unified since independence, it has faced ethnic and racial issues up to this day. So, experiments with freedom. What is this experience like for these countries? Newly independent third world countries experimented with a variety of political and economic systems in the second half of the 20th century, with mixed results. The book will split this heading into three sections: political, economic, and cultural. So first, the political one. Experiments in political order. The third world has had a huge variety of political systems in the years and decades after independence. Communism, multi-party democracy, single-party democracy, military dictatorships. On this map, you might remember something like this before. We have the Cold War era alliances of the democratic world in blue, the communist world in red, and what we're talking about in this chapter is what's called the third world, predominantly in Africa and in Asia, which is green on this map. This section will keep the focus on Africa and India. The transition to independent rule was relatively smooth in India with a successful democracy, and has been much more difficult in Africa. And the section will review quite a few of the reasons why historians say that Africa has had a difficult time transitioning to independence. Some of these include ethnic and tribal identities, the huge cultural diversity of Africa, and the challenges of sudden competition between rival political parties. There's also been quite a bit of economic disappointment as well, and in many countries the military has stepped in to take temporary or long-term control. This map here, everything that has got slashing diagonal lines here are countries that at some point through the 1970s had a military coup or a military takeover. However, this ballot box that's in many places here are countries that have had elections since 1980. So this trend is moving away from military dictatorship, but as you can see by this map, it was quite widespread to have these dictatorships. So since the 80s, Africa has been improving politically and economically, and that's largely due to the failure of these authoritarian dictatorships that took over in the 70s but really didn't deliver on any of their promises. So basically, Africa has faced quite a few challenges in its years of independence and has had a variety of systems and a variety of degrees of success. The next heading reviews experiments in economic development. And this, of course, is a critical issue for these third world countries that your book refers to as the Global South. A variety of methods have been tried to help spur economic development in the decades since independence. The main debate in these countries has been between the concept of a state-run and a government-managed economy and free market growth, in which business operates independently of government. This heading will go over examples of both approaches and a variety of solutions to problems. For instance, there's the example of microloans, where banks give very small loans to individuals to help spur their economic development. A critical issue that's related to economic development that the third world has faced has been population growth. And this graph, if you see here, separates the population growth starting in 1750 of the developed or industrialized countries in yellow, which you can see is very gradual, and the developing countries in green. And this projects growth into the year 2050. And this is a huge challenge when a country is trying to create economic growth and economic opportunity. There's been a lot of other issues that have been critical for economic growth, including the role of women, how to spend government resources, and the degree of reliance on foreign aid. Look at the snapshot in this chapter, which covers 2 whole pages, to compare results of economic growth in different parts of the world. The last heading is called Experiments with Culture, and shifts the focus to the role of Islam in Turkey and Iran. In many third world countries, there were challenges including how to react to the cultural influence of the West that imperialism and industrialization brought. In Turkey, Ataturk, the founder of the modern nation, who you can see here in Western-style clothing, created a Western secular Turkish state out of the debris of the fallen Islamic Ottoman Empire. And he took rather extreme measures to reduce the influence of Islam and Arabic culture on daily life. By contrast, in Iran, the reaction was quite different. Under the leader named Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, Iran underwent a modernization effort, which was resisted by Islamic clerics. And in the 1970s, there was a revolution led by an Islamic leader named Ayatollah Khomeini. And this is a picture of him here on the left. And this created an Islamic republic which strictly enforced Sharia law across the country, including, for instance, a traditional dress code for women, as you can see in this picture here. So these 2 countries kind of represent for us the extremes of responses to cultural influence of the West. And this has been an issue that continues into the world today, and it will be touched on again in chapter 24. Now the 10-second Spice Review. Throughout the Global South, nationalist movements opposed the social restrictions of European imperialism, eventually leading to independence across the former colonies. Since gaining independence, third world nations have been faced with a variety of challenges, including population growth, the influence of religion on political systems, and changing economic relationships between the Global South and the Global North. Now the visual summary: independence and development in the Global South. These independence movements, both in Asia, such as India, and Africa, such as South Africa, have led to development decisions and challenges, and your book will focus on political, economic, and cultural decisions and challenges faced by these countries. That's your Chapter 23 overview. Happy reading!